CataractCoach.com, podcast series, episode number 87, with Dr. Michael Snyder, solving complex cases with artificial iris implants. Welcome back to our Cataract Coach podcast. And today I have a very special guest. We have Michael Snyder. Now, you've seen his work with the prosthetic iris, probably done more in the U.S. than anyone else, has really innovated that, but also for very complicated cases. We were recently together at a nice meeting, the Down East Ophthalmology Symposium in Maine, where I learned so much from your incredible lecture. So, Michael, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks so much for inviting me to be here. It's a special treat. Very, very excited. I'm not a big podcast pro, so I'll take any tips. If I say something dumb, you can click the mute button anytime.
It's just a simple conversation. That's the best part of it. Now, tell me, I think everyone's really fascinated by the progress that's been made with the artificial iris, and you've been involved with this like from the get-go. Tell me, what's the history behind it? What's your involvement in it?
So this basically started from day number one. When Bob Osher did the first implantation of the Morcher and Iridia rings, he and Ken Rosenthal both did those first set in 1994. And then Bob and Ken and others set up a study through the Morcher folks so that we could access it through compassionate use. And those patients really did pretty darn well functionally, but they didn't do perfectly because the apertures were still pretty large. It was still 6.5 millimeter openings, and the devices were black, so it didn't really change the overall appearance of the eyes either. So, we're constantly looking for different options that were available. And in the early 2000s, Optech had a couple devices that they released in Europe, and there was a number of us in the U.S. who put in some of those devices under a very limited IDE study that really never went anywhere. And then I think it was around 2005, Hans Reinhard Koch in Germany developed the custom flexible artificial iris along with the folks over at Human Optics. At that time, it was actually Dr. Schmidt Intraocular Linsen Company, which was subsequently purchased by Human Optics. So they started with these devices in the early mid-2000s. And then once I learned about them, we were able to put in the first one in the Western Hemisphere in 2008. And a number of us did some of these under compassionate use device exemption for a few years. And in 2013, we actually launched an IDE FDA study. And it was a fairly unique study because it wasn't a traditional industry-sponsored study. We kind of cobbled it together, and a bunch of the surgeons, banded together to make the study work, and we negotiated the protocols with the FDA. And so literally from day number one and trying to get it rolling, we were right in the thick of it, writing the protocols and negotiating how they would work. So that took us through 2018 when we got a formal FDA approval. That was pretty exciting. And then since that time, it's just been trying to get the surgeons who are interested trained. And finally, what's happened over the last couple of years is getting the Medicare and third-party insurers to start appropriately covering it for their beneficiaries. So it has been a long process. I never would have thought that it would be a decade and a half from study start to really getting things rolling, but nothing happens as fast as you think it will in the regulatory world. But it's such a gratifying thing to work with these. These patients have tremendous issues with their light sensitivity problems. Some of them have significantly altered body image issues. I like to use the term body image. And why don't I like the word cosmesis? Because people evoke with the word cosmesis this person just wants to look better than they ordinarily would naturally, because we equate that with cosmetic surgery. It's really not the case. These people just want to look normal, and sometimes they have attributed their changes in appearance as inhibiting either their confidence or their career growth. You name it, I've heard it all. So the rehabilitation of this group of people is just so incredibly satisfying that it makes all of the regulatory hassles well worth it.
Yeah, the few that I've seen, the few patients, it's not about an improved cosmetic appearance. It's about feeling whole again.
That's exactly it. And some folks will say, oh, I don't care if the device is purple. I just want to reduce my light sensitivity. I've literally heard that. And interestingly, every time somebody picks, I don't care what color it is, it could be, they always pick purple. I'm not sure why, but it makes me laugh. But some people, they say, oh, I don't care what it looks like. And then of course, once it's in place, they're still like, wow, it looks like me again when I look in the mirror. And it just really, that's just the extra bonus on top of the functional issues.
About how many of these do you think you've done?
It's a pretty big number. It's somewhere a little over 600.
Wow, that's a tremendous experience.
So the cohort is relatively large, and that spans over a decade and a half, though. So it's all kind of spread across. These days, I probably have 1 or 2 on an average week in the operating room. Yesterday, I had 3, and each one of these cases is different. So it makes them unique and challenging and special. It's a lot of fun.
Well, what's always surprised me when I see videos of these being done is just how large they are. This is much bigger than an IOL. And even the way you have a special technique of kind of shoehorning it into the bag.
Yeah, and it's so nice because we can actually inject the ones that are going into the capsular bag through an IOL injector that goes through a traditional 2.2, 2.4 incision. But getting that 10 millimeter-ish diameter, we size them for the capsular bag. It's usually around 10, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. And getting a 10 millimeter device through a 5 millimeter capsulorhexis requires a little challenge. And when we first started doing these, we tried all kinds of different things. We made radial incisions in the periphery of the device and tried to sneak it in one way and then sneak it in another. And then we discovered that as the bags contracted a bit, they would always buckle right where that incision was. So we stopped doing that. And then what we've settled on is a technique now where we actually will grab the device after it's partly in the bag, but fully inside the eye. We grab it by its internal pseudopupil with a microforceps. And just like your twist and out procedure, we roll it over upon itself. And that reduces the outer perimeter enough that we can just gently tuck it underneath the capsulorhexis margin. So I feel like it's kind of the twist and in, if you will, compared to your twist and out.
Yeah, and we're happy to feature a video of it. If you send me whatever video clips you like, and we'll feature the day after your podcast a video of your procedure. But no, I've really been impressed by the way it looks. But yeah, it certainly requires some experience to get in there. Now, are you ever worried about late bag dislocation, especially with this big device in the bag, plus you've got a CTR in the bag, plus you've got an IOL in the bag, a lot of stuff in the bag?
Well, Uday, I'm a worrier. So if you ever ask me, do you ever worry about, the answer is always, of course I do, because that's my nature. I worry about stuff. And we've seen a number of these people come through because some of these patients have been traumatic injury patients. Some of them have been congenital anoretics. All of these patients have some degree of zonulopathy. And so even when the bag looks like it's doing great at the time of insertion, years down the road, sometimes the bags will get looser. And as it turns out, it's much easier to manage than you would think. Because when we're doing a primary cataract surgery, it's fairly straightforward to put in a Cioni ring or a capsular tension segment. If the same patient comes in a routine cataract case 10 years down the road, reopening that capsular bag with the Sommering ring and with the fibrosis that's occurred over that time to try and place either a ring or segment can be a real hassle. Right. And in a patient that has already had a YAG capsulotomy, which after those years many do, it becomes nearly impossible. However, an interesting thing about the eyes that have a custom iris in place in the bag is that the iris device is made of silicone. And so the capsule doesn't stick to it at all.
Oh.
And so it's actually rather straightforward to repair these. We basically just place 2 Ahmed segments into the bag and suture them to the scleral wall. And it's really, it almost feels like cheating. It comes out so straightforwardly.
Wow. So you're suturing with Gore-Tex perhaps?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of using the EPTFE Gore-Tex suture for a couple of reasons. It is an off-label use of the suture for any ophthalmic use, but The nice thing about it is, well, to be blunt, it's a forever chemical. It's not going anywhere. That suture will last longer than any patient I put it in. It will last longer than me.
Right.
And my philosophy is I always want to be the last time I'm inside the eye for that kind of problem. So I know that if I'm going to use a Gore-Tex suture, it's going to last forever. Prolene sutures, as we know, the 10-0 and 9-0 prolene sutures have a longevity to them, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 11 years is what we found with many of these older Sione sutured rings and such. The 6-0 prolines probably with the rivets have a longer tenure, but we don't know how long that tenure is. We haven't been around for 7 to 11 years with that technique. So maybe it'll be a lot longer, maybe it won't. But I know that the Gore-Tex sutures are going to be there forever.
Right. The caveat, though, with Gore-Tex, if you haven't worked with it, for our listeners, it's slippery. You make sure your knots are square and tight.
You are so right. And interestingly, if you look at the labeling, and I personally almost never read the entire labeling that things come out, but my friend Greg Ogawa does. He's the guy who reads that stuff.
Okay.
And I remember early on, he told me, he says, Mike, the manufacturer recommends that you put 7 separate throws in to lock this knot. And while that's actually designed for cardiovascular use, I usually will put in 5 throws. I usually do a double wrap and then 4 single throws to follow. But if we just do 2 or 3 throws on these, you can actually pull the suture apart with a little bit of tension. And so that would be really undesirable. If you do a beautiful case and you go to tuck the knot inside and then it unwraps after you tuck it inside, oh, that's snatching defeat from the jaws of victory.
No, for sure. Now, you've also used this case in more complicated situations where you're even like fixating the IOL to the back of it. I've seen this as well.
Yeah, so in patients who have a completely anuritic and aphakic eye with no capsular support structures, there's a bunch of different ways I've done these. Initially, I would suture the implant lens to the iris device and then suture the implant lens to the eye wall. And then I started suturing the implant lens to the iris device and suturing the iris device to the eye wall.
Sure.
And then I started doing them separately. I would suture the implant lens and then using the same sclerotomies, suture the iris device. The interesting thing is, it turns out it's easier and faster to suture them separately by about 20 minutes. You wouldn't think so. It's counterintuitive, but I've done a bunch in every way. And it turns out it's actually just easier and faster to put them in separately, sequentially, using the same sclerotomies and using the same incisions. There are still some instances, though, where I will suture the device to the back of the iris. For example, there's a case that I did just this week. The patient had extraordinarily high regular astigmatism and already had corneal relaxing incisions in place. And so there was no real good way to get after that 6 diopters of astigmatism. So I actually sutured a 6 diopter toric IOL to the back of the device and then oriented the whole complex so that the toric axis was on the steep axis. And at least so far at day 1, we're doing pretty good. Patient was 20/80 at day 1, which actually for one of these kinds of cases, I'm going to call that a big win.
Right. Now, are most of your cases for these anuritic implants, are these trauma cases? Are these congenital aniridia? What types of cases are these mostly?
So my practice is probably a little distorted from what the numbers are across the country because I work in the same group as Ed Holland. And Ed Holland has the largest cohort of congenital aniritic patients that he follows in the world. So, he's just at the other office down the street. And so he and I share these patients back and forth. He takes care of their stem cells. Fred Chu takes care of their glaucoma tubes. And then I usually will do their cataracts and artificial iris and frequently sutured capsular tension rings. So I see a lot more congenital aniritics than the average individual. So for me, it's probably about even for congenital aniridia and trauma. And then there's a whole host of other things that fill in the little tuck-in gaps. We have ICE syndrome patients. I just saw today a lady with Bates syndrome, the so-called bilateral iris atrophy syndrome, had an episode of iritis. Who knows what the trigger was, whether it was a fluoroquinolone or not, we don't know. It's been implicated as oral fluoroquinolones causing this idiosyncratically in some folks. And she has just no iris pigment. It's all gone. She almost looks like an albino patient. And these people also, interestingly, get midriatic issues because their sphincter muscles also just kind of collapse. And so they do really well with iris prostheses. And then, there's the patients with Rieger's anomalies and so on and so forth. Interestingly, what we see not a trivial number of, but significant in the number of patients, but not a large percentage, is people who have had IFAS. So we've all had cases of IFAS where the temporal iris just gets damaged at the time of a cataract surgery, and they lose a ton of pigment. And if it's only a couple clock hours, you can often oversew it. But in people who have really friable iris tissue, oftentimes it can extend 3 clock hours, or if an iridodialysis occurs and the iris gets more damaged. So I've probably done at least a few dozen that are just post-IFAS cases.
Wow. Now, for the congenital bilateral aniridia patients, do you let them choose their iris color?
Yeah, sure do. We actually have a library of pictures. When we take pictures for people, we kind of fine tune it, and it's like, no, this one looks a little bluer than it should. So we, set that one aside. Let me make it a little greener. Let me do another one. Oh, it's a little too green. We'll make it a little more blue. So we actually have a big stack of papers, and they can flip through those, or they can take their own picture and bring in and choose what they want. Interestingly, we had one little kid that I operated on some years ago. He was 5 years old at the time, had amblyogenic cataract from congenital aniridia. And his mom had kind of green hazel irises, and his dad had a green iris that was half brown and half green. And he says, do you suppose that I could do one of my mom's eyes and one of my dad's eyes?
Oh, interesting.
It's like, yeah, you know what? They're close enough. They match reasonably well. Why the heck not? So
enjoy. Oh, that's neat. Now, you were saying you have quite the network of colleagues there. At Holland, you said you got your glaucoma specialist. Now, how did you end up at this obviously very famous Cincinnati Eye Institute? You're not from Cincinnati, right?
No. While I am a Midwesterner, I came to Cincinnati not from Michigan, but from having spent about a decade on the East Coast. I had been working in upstate New York at the time in a setting which was fine, but just fine. As many of us, our first jobs are just fine. And Bob Osher was at a conference with Roger Steiner. Roger was my mentor, for those who know Roger. Incredible, phenomenal individual. I miss him dearly. So in any event, Roger and Bob were at some conference somewhere, and Bob said, boy, we're just swamped at CEI, and Bob Cioni and I are just getting absolutely buried. Do you know anybody who might be willing to come and interview with us? So Roger said, well, I think Mike might be looking. And Bob called me up that night, and he said, would you like to come out to Cincinnati and take a look at what we got going on? So I'm like, sure. 3 weeks later, I was on an airplane, and we landed in Cincinnati. Bob is an amazing force of nature.
Sure.
I think we came in like 8, 9 o'clock at night, and he picked my wife and I up at the airport, took us out to dinner. We finished dinner at about 11 o'clock, took us over to the Eye Institute. We did an 11 o'clock to midnight tour of the Eye Institute. And then we played tennis from midnight to 1 o'clock in the morning. And at 1 o'clock, I crashed and Bob went for a run. So, the next day, I had interviews with about 20 of the partners. And then the rest is history.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, Roger Steiner was such an incredible man. It's obviously passed way too young.
Much too young. Incredible surgeon, incredible physician, and just an overall fabulous human being in every way.
Yeah, we got to have him here in Southern California for a little bit. He, as chairman of UC Irvine and chair of the Gavin Herbert Eye Institute here.
Yeah, I understand that he was actively involved in the development of the institute there, and certainly his leadership was a huge benefit. So, the East Coast is lost was your gain.
Right. What were some of the most important pearls you picked up from him, kind of for practice as a whole, practice in general?
Well, Roger had a way of being able to focus on what he was doing, and everything else in the world didn't matter during a case. He was focused on what he was doing. He was always very calm and serene. Sometimes patients don't always hold steady, right? We all know that. And I've been in operating rooms where Mrs. Jones, you move, you're going to go blind, right? And that's not Roger. Roger was always like, Mrs. Jones, it would sure be a lot easier if you might be able to hold super still. And he would do it with a disarming laugh. Oh, I know you're probably nervous. No need. He had this calming demeanor about him.
Right.
It was absolutely incredible. The other thing that Roger always did is he always thought about everything he was going to do in advance. And he planned his cases from the moment that he saw the patient in the clinic. And, you didn't see Roger coming in the morning saying, oh my God, I've got some really tough cases today. What do you think I ought to do with this? He would always have his plan in place, typically with the patient. And then after we'd see the patient, you'd say, okay, well, we talk it through together. And that plan was in place, set in his head, written on his notes. And he would look at the chart the next time in the operating room when we start the case.
Wow.
And that actually kind of resonated with me. I'm not a particularly good review the chart the night before kind of guy when I'm probably exhausted from the previous day and not at my best mental thinking. So I kind of picked up that technique of making all of my plans while I'm there with the patient, creating my surgical plan, picking my IOLs, making notes about what I might want to do in the operating room based on the exam while it's all very, very fresh in my head. And then I don't look at the chart again until it's hanging from the microscope.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, I'll tell you a funny story. My partner, Jamie Osher, is a retina doc with us, who's amazing. So a number of years ago, Jamie and I had a combined case together scheduled for a Monday morning. And I walked into the locker room and I'm getting my stuff set. And Jamie had been worrying about this case and trying to figure out what he was going to do. And he barely slept the night before because he was kind of trying to cogitate about this case in advance. And so he says, Mike, how do you think we ought to approach this combo case that we're doing first thing this morning? And I looked at him and I said, oh, we've got a combo case this morning? Great. He was like, I lost all this sleep and you didn't even realize we were doing the case until he walked in. So that's just kind of my mantra, because as my retina partner, Chris Riemann, says, I'm not in the habit of scheduling cases that I don't know how to do. So I plan them in advance. And then once that plan is in place, I don't worry so much.
I like that method. That makes a whole lot of sense, especially in a situation like yours where you have a tremendous number of unusual cases, trauma cases, referral cases. You don't do a whole lot of 8mm pupil and 2+ NS.
No, it's actually sometimes a surprise when I walk into a room. It's like, are you sure this is my patient?
Now, how do you approach a tough case like that? So you see a patient in your clinic. Let's see something we see commonly. You got a patient in there and you look and they dilate poorly and you see they have all that pseudoexfoliation material. You notice that their AC is a little on a normal axial length, but a shallow AC, which always kind of gives me a sick feeling in my stomach.
Sure.
How do you approach these cases in the OR?
So, well, for the pseudoexfoliation patients, even if they've got normal looking zonules, a normal AC, I always presume that they're going to have zonulopathy from the start.
Okay.
And every once in a while, I get a big surprise. I have a partner who does not like dealing with those kinds of cases at all. And if he's got a patient that's got a bunch of pseudoexfoliation material, it's like, go see Mike. I don't want to do this one. And I'm perfectly happy to do those. And every once in a while, I make a little mental note in my head. It's like, I don't know why my partner didn't do this one. This is just going to be a regular, straightforward case. And then it's not. But if it's not, we've got great tools available. We can use the Sione sutured rings. We can use an Ahmed segment if we need double fixation, or for those folks who just like to put in Ahmed segments with a separate capsular tension ring, that works too. We've got David Chang's capsule hooks and capsule retractors that work really well. So my approach is to plan for what I think I'm going to need, but I have all the tools in the operating room available. And if I need to add capsule hooks because it looks loose as I start my capsulorhexis, so be it. We add some capsule hooks.
Right.
I do tend to hunker down for these cases. I don't plan on them being a 10-minute case. I plan on being in there for a little bit. And even if the zonules are totally normal, I'll put a ring in anyhow. There's some conflict as to whether putting a ring in reduces the incidence or rate of subluxation.
Sure.
And I don't know whether it does, and I don't know whether it doesn't. But what I do know is that if somebody comes in to see me after I did cataract surgery on them 5-10 years ago, and now they've got a subluxated implant lens capsular bag complex with a capsular tension ring in it, well, that's pretty easy to fix.
Because the CTR, of course.
The CTR's in there. You can wrap a couple sutures around it. I usually will just put in 3 loop sutures around the ring in a tripod, and that case is going to be fine forever. If, on the other hand, I didn't put a ring in and the capsular bag complex is loose, oftentimes these patients will also have a dead bag, and then it's going to become a vitrectomy sutured PCIOL case, which is bigger incision, more work, a little more OR time. So I put the capsular tension rings in, not so much prophylactically for what they might or might not do in changing the incidence, but prophylactically for making my job easier later down the road. And I tell my patients that, I say, I'm putting the ring in because if you have a problem later down the road, it makes my job easier, and it's good for you if my job is easier.
Right, it's easier for them too. You said 2 important things. One is make sure you book it appropriately. So don't put it in that 10-minute slot to get done. Maybe book it for a larger slot in your schedule, or if you don't do a ton of these cases, put it at the end of your day so you're not pressed for time. And the other one was, I've always fixated these with 2 fixation points, 180 degrees apart, but you're like a tripod with 3 spots, 120 degrees apart.
So I think you can do either. If I'm fixing primarily and I'm putting in either a ring or a capsular tension segment, then I'll typically do 180 degrees and dual fixation. If I'm putting in loops around a capsular tension ring, I don't have quite as much control over torque as I do with a primary procedure because the anatomy is not as favorable as it's already, as I want it to be. And I can't fine tune the centration as well with 2 points as I can with 3. And so it doesn't add a whole lot of time. I just put in 3, but I would never fault anybody for putting in 2. It just doesn't give me as much control over tilt and torque. And in eyes that have already had an issue, again, my philosophy is once I've been in there to fix something once, I don't want to have to fix the same thing twice.
Right. Now, is it just me, or are we seeing an increase in late bag IOL complex dislocation?
Well, I think what we're seeing is greater human longevity.
Right.
And patients who are having cataract surgery at earlier ages. So our success rates just get better and better and better. And so now our threshold for interventions have gotten a little bit lower.
Right.
Somebody who might have come in with 20/25 vision, and it's like, yeah, the New York Times is a little smeary when I'm trying to read it, and I need good light, and I have a little bit of glare at night, but I'm functional. That patient, 25 years ago, probably would have gotten you want to wait it out for a little while or what?
Wait till they're ripe.
I'm sorry?
Wait till the cataracts are ripe.
Don't even get me started on ripe. But but our threshold has appropriately changed as we have success rates north of 99%. And so we're doing surgery earlier in people's lives, and people are lasting longer. That's great. Our medicine colleagues are doing a great job. People are lasting longer. And so the time frame from when they're having cataract surgery to when they no longer need their implant lens anymore, well, that interval is getting longer and longer. So the number of cases is necessarily going to increase because there's a longer interval for them to happen. The incidence may not be any different, but the prevalence is going up.
Yeah, I see what you mean, because a lot of the ones that I've seen recently are patients who had cataract surgery 30 years ago when they were 60, and now they're 90, And now you start to see the late dislocation.
And 30 years ago, 90 was a cliff.
Right.
Now, lots of folks in their mid and even late 90s show up at the office all the time. So I think that that's more of what we're seeing, to be honest.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense then. Yeah, because yes, the patients that I've seen they're 30 plus years out from IOL surgery. And even you look at the lenses that are in the bag, like that's an old style lens. We don't use that anymore.
Isn't it amazing? One of the things that we like to do at CEI, we have a conference that CEI and University of Cincinnati does about once every month or two, where we do an imaging conference. And we just take a bunch of slit lamp photos that either myself or Adam Kaufman have pulled off of our slit lamp cameras as sole images. And we run maybe 50 to 80 of them in a given evening. And we throw up an image and we say to the resident, what's going on here? Okay. And invariably in every 100th or 150th image, we'll have like one of these old PMMA IOLs that has a hole in the IOL. And we take a picture of the hole in the IOL and we throw it up to the residents. What's going on here? It's like, something's wrong with that IOL. Was it like did they have a laser treatment that went awry? They don't even know that IOLs had holes in them because you just don't see them that much anymore. But they still crop up from time to time and they're super interesting.
Or you look at the IOL that has the power printed on it. It'll say 19.5. You're like,
I've got one of those in my cohort. It's a 19.0 diopter IOLab IOL. And when I first saw it, I'm like, wow, that's so cool. You don't need the records. You know exactly what power it is.
Yeah, interesting to see how much it's changed just over the years. Now, tell me more also about CEI. It's a huge institute. I've never been. I probably should visit one day and learn from you guys.
Hey, open invitation. We'd love to have you as an honored guest.
Yeah, tell me about the place. I've never even been.
So Bob Osher's dad actually started the practice, and it was just a couple of guys. And his dad was the first one in Cincinnati to start putting in intraocular lenses at the time of cataract surgery. And then, Bob was, I think, number 4 in the practice, or number 5. And he grew the practice from 5 to 25.
Wow.
And so he built it into what is the Cincinnati Eye Institute. And I was number 14. I thought it was big then. Now CEI's footprint in Cincinnati, I think there's about 60 or 70 docs in the Cincinnati marketplace. And when we add in Northern Kentucky and Dayton, we're closer to 100. And so now it's a pretty big organization. I used to know all of my partners pretty well. Now I at least know just about everybody's name and can pick most of them out of a mug sheet. But there's some folks who are perhaps at the Dayton marketplace who I don't even see that often. But there's still a group of about 50 that work in the central Cincinnati zone that we all overlap regularly, and we do combined cases together. And it's a really wonderful group. And I think it's really because Bob started the culture of the organization by selecting people who are good fits for the culture.
What would you say the culture is?
We're a pretty collegial group.
Yeah.
We put patients first. It's a very patient-oriented environment. So patient care is number 1 on what we do. And we treat each other respectfully. We try and seek out people who are team players. Because at the end of the day, you want to work with people who work hard, take great care of patients, and are happy to be part of a team.
No, of course. And who like to play tennis at midnight.
It's funny because at that interview, we rallied for about an hour or so. And I actually thought I was doing pretty well. And I'm not a great athlete as Bob is. And I thought I was holding my own and rather proud of myself because I knew that he was a great athlete. And I really thought I was doing pretty good. Years later, I realized that I hadn't noticed he had been playing me lefty because he had hurt his right shoulder. And so he was playing me with his non-dominant hand.
Well, that's a pretty good athlete then. That's pretty darn good.
Yeah, Bob was a ranked tennis player. When I met him, he was not a golfer. but he subsequently took up golf some decade or so later, and is now a ranked golfer in his group. And there's nothing that Bob does that he doesn't do really, really well.
Sure.
And in fact, one of my favorite stories is that years ago, I was at a Canadian conference being held in Edinburgh. And so my wife and I went to Edinburgh for this conference, and we were jet lagged. So we're walking around downtown streets of old Edinburgh at like midnight to 2 o'clock in the morning, just because we were awake and we had something to do. And we went back to the hotel at about 2 in the morning, and we went into the lobby of the hotel, and we heard from the second lobby that was a little further down the street, just beautiful piano music. It was a lovely classical piano. And we thought, isn't that lovely? And then we thought to ourselves, boy, isn't that weird that they've got somebody playing the piano at 2 o'clock in the morning? It's like, but no bother, let's go enjoy it. We're jet lagged. We don't want to go to sleep. And we walked over to the second lobby, and who but Bob was sitting there tickling the ivories.
Wow. That's a neat story. Yeah, it's a neat place. I definitely have to come, visit and learn. Obviously, it's how you guys do things. I think the neat part is having so many colleagues. You can kind of really ultra specialize. Like you said, Ed has a clinic of just, aniridia patients, the largest there is.
Well, the old story that the more you specialize, you learn more and more about less and less until you eventually know everything about nothing.
That's true, right? Right. I get that. I mean, I had a friend send me a patient, and I said, "Oh, the patient has a retina problem. I don't do retina." And he was so confused. He said, "Wait a minute, don't you do eyes?" I'm like, "Yeah." He says, like the two things the size of walnuts. You don't do the whole walnut, the whole eyeball. I'm like, "No, just part of it." And it was just to the non-ophthalmologists, they were just like, "What?"
I remember many years ago when I was a young resident in training, and I was learning about some of the work that Don Gass was doing down at Miami, and that he was really one of the first people who considered himself a maculologist.
Right.
And so, those of us in our residency program kind of kidded around. It's like, where do you go more specialized from there? Do you become a right eye maculologist or a left eye maculologist?
Well, the interesting thing is you look at the Gass Atlas that I got when I was a resident in the late 1990s. The pictures he drew are basically OCT scans before the invention of OCT.
Absolutely is. And he was such an incredible observer. He had to have like 20/5 vision.
Something.
Because he drew pictures that none of us really understood before OCT.
Right. You go back and look at it now, you're like, oh my goodness. He literally drew the OCT images prior to the invention of OCT.
I remember looking at his pictures of cystoid macular edema, and then, seeing patients who their angiogram showed, CME when I was a resident. And I would just kind of have to imagine that his picture was what I was looking at. It's like, well, I can sort of imagine that it's probably like that. But some of that, I think, was probably creative production in my head.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, in ophthalmology, there have been such incredible giants upon whose shoulders we stand. Oh, wow. Just really, it's a humbling field for sure.
Well, and again, that's what makes it, part of being a team. And, we have a big team at CEI, but I think that teams actually go wider than that. For example, you're probably a team member for just about everybody in the country. I think every resident that's training right now, if they're not familiar with CataractCoach, they're probably a resident in some other field, because I can't tell you how many folks sign on to your website regularly to learn new techniques, to learn how to enhance their current techniques. Sure. So you have become a mentor on the team of, well, just about everybody out there. So congratulations and thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. It's like, as you know, I learn more than I teach. I mean, I learn from all these other videos that are sent to me every week. Incredible stuff. It certainly made me a better surgeon by making the videos, for sure.
Well, it's incredibly impressive. And I just learned when we were up in Maine together a couple of weeks ago about the fact that you make sure to edit at least one video every day, which I think is absolutely incredible. You were the inventor of the streak before streaks existed.
Yeah, no, we're at almost 2,400 videos. One new one every day. Haven't missed a day yet. So it's like I said, fine line between craziness and passion. I don't know where exactly on that spectrum I land, but somewhere in there.
Well, you know how people say that something might be able to drive them crazy?
Yeah.
My usual feeling about that is I don't need anything to drive me crazy because I live so close I can walk from here.
Oh, too funny. Now, let me ask you about other stuff in cataract surgery. What else are you looking forward to getting your hands on? Because you're usually at the cutting edge of new stuff. What's coming down the road? What should we get you prepared to have in the near future?
Oh gosh, the near future, some of the things I really look forward to having my hands on, I know I'm never going to get my hands on. For example, the Ossi anchor. Ehud Assia has developed his anchor for these zonular dialysis cases. And I love the Sione ring, and I although don't love the Ahmed segment because sometimes there are torque issues with it. The Ossi anchor I've played with in the lab, and it is so easy that it feels like cheating.
We have a video of it on CataractCoach that he sent in.
Yeah, and the new Ossi anchor can go in through a large paracentesis incision, and it's easy to fixate, it's easy to place. Unfortunately, I think it's not overly likely that we'll ever get it here because of the cost barriers to bringing in new devices. I just don't think there's enough zonulopathy cases to justify the investment that it would take to go through the regulatory process. I'm still trying to figure out a way to do it, but I'm a little bit disheartened that that's one thing I won't get my hands on. I'm not sure when we're going to get them, but I know that we will at some point have flexible, injectable, true accommodating IOLs. Not sure when that's going to happen, but I look forward to when it does. Some of the things that are exciting for me that we've recently added is the light adjustable lens is something that we've just incorporated over the last year or so in our practice. And that's been a lot of fun. I didn't expect it to be as much interest as I would have thought. But it's turned out that especially for some of these really unusual eyes, some of these old RK eyes, they work really well. And, one of the other things that I'd love to get access to is some of the sulcus-based pseudophakic technologies, right? So there's actually some sulcus-based presbyopia correction options that are non-multifocal. Having access to some of the sulcus-based multifocality, where we can add multifocality to patients who have remorse about not having chosen it to start with, or add toricity or low power adjustments to pseudofakes who we don't have other great options for. Those are tools which our colleagues in Europe have right now that I'm hoping that we'll get at some point in the not too distant future. It's just super exciting, the technology that people are developing, and I just hope that much of it will eventually land its way here in the US.
Yeah, some of it's tough. Like I had a colleague who was discussing about for an aphakic patient with no capsular support, but a normal iris. He said, well, listen, just do the Artisan iris clip lens and for aphakia and clip it to the back of the iris and you're done. I'm like, yeah, but we don't have that available in the US.
It's funny because years ago, I would have patients who would say, boy, your technology is amazing. Imagine what you'll be doing in 10 years. And my usual response to that in the past was, I don't have to imagine what I'll be doing in 10 years. I just call my friends in Europe and I say, what are you doing today? And whatever that is, that's what I'm going to be doing in 10 years. But now their regulatory process for CE mark has become increasingly challenging and is now rivaling the FDA and may even become more persnickety than our own regulatory process. So I guess we need to look to South America and Asia.
Yeah, something. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if there's actually going to be a solution to this. I think it's, at least in my career, I haven't seen things become easier to get through the FDA. It's been the same onerous kind of battle for any device.
Not only for devices, but for pharmaceuticals. One of the huge losses for us cornea folks is the complete absence of interferon. Topical interferon was like the greatest invention in the entire world for ocular surface squamous neoplasms. It would make huge tumors just melt away. They disappear. And it had exactly 0 side effects with topical use. And so that was all fine and good as long as they were selling that for kidney tumors and liver tumors and such. But once they came up with other much more expensive medications and probably more effective for those conditions, they stopped making interferon, and we can't get it. Just about everybody else in the world still has access, but those of us in the US, interferon is gone, and now we need to use other toxic poisons, all of which have significant side effects and are less effective.
Well, I'm wondering if maybe compounding pharmacies can do it for us, get it for us.
I haven't found one that can yet, but if anybody knows one, let me know. I think the problem is that there's no problem with having the agents diluted or compounded in a different strength, which compounding pharmacies excel at. But getting the raw material does require an IND if it's not manufactured elsewhere in the US.
Yeah, that ends up being the challenge. Interesting too, though, how the landscape has changed in my own practice. 10 years ago, I'd write every cataract patient these prescriptions to go to the pharmacy. Now I just give them a compounded drop, and there's no pharmacy involved other than the compounding pharmacy.
Yeah, well, that does create a significant advantage, especially because the cost of these drops over the last 25 years or so that I've been in practice, probably similar for you, has skyrocketed. When I started in practice, we actually used to give patients branded Predfort.
Right.
We would buy them in a brick of 100 bottles for $100. It was $1 a bottle, and they were making money selling it to us at $1 a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, obviously those days are long gone.
Yeah, well, interesting how the cost of everything, any devices, any drugs, any supplies we're using have gone up. Our surgeon fees have only gone down, though.
Yes, isn't that nice? It's fascinating because in real terms, the government spends on Medicare cataract surgeries the same amount now as it has for the last several decades. And so as volume has gone up, reimbursements have gone down, and it's been a flat playing field for the feds. And of course, we have absorbed all of that. And, we've gotten more and more efficient over time, but there's going to be a limit, right? You can only approach it asymptotically. You can't do an infinite number of cases per day. That's just not possible. So at a certain point in time, shaving another 30 seconds here or another 8 seconds there is not going to help in efficiency. So, perhaps the current changing of the demographics of the population relative to the demographics of the number of ophthalmologists might have a market force that might change that, although I haven't seen it happen yet.
Yeah, time will tell. We'll just kind of see how it plays out. Now that I'm solidly mid-career, if not second half of my career.
Yeah, that reminds me of an email that had been circulating around CEI many years ago. There was some sort of contentious issue that everybody had an opinion about. I don't even remember what the issue was, but I remembered that we all had an opinion about it, and a bunch of folks were getting all fired up about it, and there was all kinds of information and misinformation. And so one of the guys decided that he was going to write a very detailed, organized email explaining how he thought it was going to affect each constituency within the organization. And so he very thoughtfully went through this whole process, and he said it's going to affect the younger guys like this, and it's going to affect the established guys like that, and it's going to affect the senior folks like this. And I'm reading it, and I'm reading it. No, I don't think that's right. That's not right. And then I suddenly had this realization that at that moment in time, I was no longer considered to be one of the younger guys. I was in the established group, and it's like, oh, shoot. That's not what I was expecting. But yeah, I guess he's right.
Yeah, that's the wild part. It doesn't seem like I've been at it this long. I can't believe that I finished my training that long. I finished in 2000. I just like, wow, it's been 24 years. Seriously? Like, whoa.
I think we're very lucky to be able to really enjoy what we do. We
Yeah.
have one of the best jobs on the planet, and it's hard to beat that. And so, every day is a joy. Well, most every day.
Yeah, I know for sure. Now, I want to get back just as we're wrapping up here, talking about the iris implants again. So if we have a young surgeon out there or older surgeon who wants to get started with this, what's the best way? It's not a simple thing to get started with.
Yeah. So for younger folks who are interested in starting this, they're great cases. They're really fun cases when they're done. Sometimes halfway through, you might wonder, is this really fun or not? But they're really fun cases when they're done. And so for people who like a challenge, it's a great area to get into, and it's a lot of fun. There is a credentialing process that the distributor has. They do recommend, I think appropriately, that the right time to jump in is probably not your first year out of fellowship. It's probably, after you've got, 1,000 cases or so under your belt and you feel super comfortable with things like sutured PCIOLs or other scleral fixation methods for PCIOLs, when you feel comfortable managing vitreous in the anterior segment on an expected or unexpected basis, because these kinds of eyes that require iris prostheses tend to be sick eyes, and they can always throw a little surprise in partway through that you might not have thought about. And so you have to have an action plan for any of those. So usually it's folks who are maybe a minimum of 2 or 3 years into their building of their practice, who are building practices in complex cases, that would choose to seek this out. And then once somebody's interested, they can contact any of the folks who are doing it regularly, and we can hook them up with a distributor to go through the online training course, and which is really rather robust. And once somebody's done the online training course, the distributor will send them the wet lab supplies, or really dry lab supplies, using Stuart Stoll's simulis that were developed strictly for the artificial iris, to practice in their own operating room with their own instrumentation. And once they're comfortable with the techniques, well, then it's time for working on real humans.
Right.
But it's a really nice way to do things, because you can take those stages as fast or slow as you feel comfortable with. And just like you've been so generous in guiding people and mentoring people through complex cataract, those folks who are interested in artificial iris cases, there's lots of us, including you, who have experience in these, who are happy to walk through cases with people in advance by phone and kind of walk through, oh, well, tell me about your case. It's like, oh, I had one like that. Let me tell you what pitfalls to watch out for.
Right.
And how do you learn about the pitfalls? Well, I must have read about it in a book somewhere. Right now, it's we experience things and we learn from our experiences. And whenever there's an opportunity to share those experiences, so our colleagues don't have to learn the hard way, that's what it's all about. So, and maybe putting up more videos onto CataractCoach.
Well, certainly, if you send me any video, I'm happy to put it up, especially these artificial iris ones. And then, like you said, there are some really important pearls that you may not think about. Like, for example, for the audience, if you've never done these, you have to stay in the capsule trypan blue. Otherwise, it's impossible to see it.
Yeah, that was case number 2 when I learned that one.
Right? So it's amazing.
It was a rude awakening.
So now you have a fantastic lecture, by the way, about I'm all about, like, a 45-minute lecture all about these artificial irises, which I've seen and I've really enjoyed learning from. Like, wow, those are some great pearls.
Well, they're fun cases, but when you've got a beautiful view of the capsulorhexis margin, you don't think about the fact that when the red reflex disappears, so does that.
No, for sure, because that big implant, as it goes in the bag, it blocks all your red reflex. And if you didn't stay in the capsule, good luck figuring out where it is.
Yeah,
So,
I still follow that patient. It was 15 years ago exactly.
it's interesting also to learn from experience, like you said, making relaxing cuts in the periphery of it. Well, no, that's when the capsular bag is going to contract. You're gonna wrinkle the implant, the iris.
And at one point, we actually had a debate about whether we needed to put capsular tension rings in the congenital anorectics, because congenital anoretic capsules are so fragile and so thin that we worried that we might break the capsule by putting a ring in. So like, well, maybe we don't need them since these capsules are so thin. Well, guess what?
You need
You
it.
do. Ask me how I know.
Well, that's how it's funny. That's how we all learn together. That's the best part. And you're so generous. I think you're probably the most experienced surgeon I've ever met with the iris stuff. And you're so generous with your learning and even your offer to help mentor a new surgeon.
You know, I wish I could keep up your standards of adding a case a day.
Well, it's easy now that I'm an empty nester, much easier, but it is a lot of work. But I want to thank you again, Mike, for doing this. Our hour has gone by like that. What an amazing conversation. Learned so much. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
All right. I want to remind our listeners and viewers, remember, we got a new podcast every single week on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Google, anywhere where you find your podcast. Plus, of course, we got a new CataractCoach video every single day. And we're going to hopefully have a nice video from Dr. Snyder teaching you some pearls and pitfalls for those artificial iris cases. So until next time, I'll check you later.